Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining this panel on the future of water governance. My name is Philip Loring. I'm an associate professor at the University of Guelph, where I hold the Arrow Chair in Food Policy and Society. And I'm joining you today from the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, also known as Dish with One Spoon territory, what is now called Guelph, Ontario. I'm really excited to be here to moderate this panel with some really wonderful folks in a conversation about the future of water governance. Briefly, I will introduce all of them, and then I'm going to get us started into an opening round of questions to start the conversation, and then hopefully people will chime in the audience with questions as you see fit, and I will try to get to as many of them as I can. On the panel, we have with us today Dr. Deborah McGregor, who's an associate professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice. She's at York University's Osgoode Hall Law School. Hi, Deborah. We also have Dr. Dustin Garrick, an associate professor of global water policy at University of Waterloo. Hi, Dustin. Nice to see you. We also have Dr. Leila Eamen, a postdoctoral researcher at the Global Institute for Water Security, who also is bringing with her over 15 years of experience as a practitioner in water, which I'm really grateful for that perspective. Hi, Leila. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Graham Strickert. It's nice to see you, Graham, assistant professor at the School of Environment and Sustainability and the Global Institute for Water Security at University of Saskatchewan. So as I said, we are here to talk about the future of water governance, tools for water governance approaches, thinking about uncertainty in the future. And so I thought I would start with getting a few words from everybody on the panel, perhaps in that same order, starting with Dr. McGregor, about what you think the biggest challenge is right now facing how we approach and govern water.
Thank you. That is such a huge question, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other panelists to see kind of where their headspace is at. For me, in my recent thinking around this, and I've been thinking about it in relation to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the World Water Reports, is, for me, fundamentally, I guess it's an ontological question around what we even consider to be water. So I find in a lot of those processes, water is understood to be a commodity and a resource. I mean, I should say upfront that I'm coming at this from an Indigenous perspective. So that's sort of the lens from which that's the lens that I see the world through. So I apply that when I'm looking at a lot of these different reports. So I think that's one of the big challenges that we have, because there's a certain set of assumptions that come with that. Water is a resource, water is separate from people. Like, there's these underlying assumptions that I see that come from particular perspectives of water. So to me, that's harder to grapple with, like a tool, a process, and a product would have a hard time dealing with that. But I do think it's a question that we need to consider. I think for me, again, from an Indigenous perspective, one of the biggest challenges is inequities in almost every single level of water governance that there is, whether it's global or whether it's local or in First Nation or in Indigenous communities. It's just really characterized by inequities. Processes to try to deal with that is through human rights mechanisms that we see, and also potential Indigenous rights mechanisms as well, to try to address these inequities in water governance. People who should be there, genders, whoever should be at the table, are not, in terms of decision making and governance in a lot of these kind of processes. So I see that as a major challenge in relation to this. So to me, water is not governed, I guess, equitably or appropriately. I don't think we have all the knowledge that we need, like collectively as humanity, to make the best decisions that we can in relation to water. I guess that would be one way that I would prefer to talk about it. So that basically means there's not only water insecurity for humans and human consumption and use, because that's the priority, but also for all living things. Every IPCC report that comes out, every World Water Reports that comes out, is pointing to more and more undesirable consequences, very bad consequences, actually. And so clearly the business as usual, tweaking of the business as usual, is inadequate, and we haven't got to that transformative thinking that needs to happen that a lot of these reports and assessments call for. So I'll stop there. I know those are pretty big things to throw out there, but just coming clean on my lens, which is looking at it again from an Indigenous perspective based on the research and work that I do. And I am dialing in from Toronto, so and I'm Anishinaabe, so I live and work in my own territory, so I'm privileged to be able to do that. So Chimigwech for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for that, Deborah. I appreciate that answer, and you've given me lots of little notes in my margins to keep our conversation going. Thank you. Dustin, do you want to go next?
Thank you very much, and it's a privilege to be with you all. I'm participating from the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and having just joined the University of Waterloo last summer in 2021, I joined this discussion very much from a position of humility and an interest in learning and listening. And in that context, I'll keep my initial interventions fairly brief and describe my entry point. My research focuses on valuing, sharing, and governing water in the context of sustainability transitions, particularly those associated with agriculture and urbanization. And my specific background is at the intersection of economics and governance, particularly in the case of economics, a field that's notorious and known for its blind spots. So in the context of water governance, in the context of the work that I've been doing on climate adaptation with long-term partners in different parts of the world that are kind of at the leading edge of climate change impacts, is to find ways to move beyond panacea thinking in water governance, which is to say that there's a one-size-fits-all way that we govern water. And in the context of process and tools, there's a lot of interest in global dialogue as well as decision-making and local planning processes to come up with appropriate indicators and principles that tell us about good governance. And so I think it's an important challenge for us to broaden our understanding of the kinds of ways of knowing and the ways of valuing water in the context of benchmarking water governance capacity. And so as part of some of the early work that our group will be contributing into the Global Water Futures discussion is trying to better understand global experiences and practices with measuring and understanding good governance. And I think that can inform the development of new models of cooperation that address these historic inequalities and legacies of exclusion, and also point us to benefit sharing, where we can find ways to work together when there is a real mutual benefit from adapting to the complex challenges around water. I'll stop there and hope we can dig in deeper through the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dustin. Leila, would you like to go next?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank for the opportunity to be here and learn from you all. But to start on that, again, I just want to acknowledge that I agree with both previous speakers. I mean, that was, I mean, it's a very wide question, so it's not easy to answer that. I just want to add one point to what I just have said before. That is from a modeler perspective, from someone who is dealing basically with modeling side of water management and water governance, as a practitioner and now as a researcher. I would say that maybe one big challenge would be just moving towards the decision-making and governing water resources in the face of changing futures, considering all the uncertainty that is associated with these different elements of water and human system. So we traditionally designed our strategies based on the optimal solution for just our best guess about future, but then we all know that that is not going to work anymore, because we don't know what would happen in the future, and then if future deviates from what we just predicted, everything might go wrong. So to me, it's important to understand how future may look like, and then collaborate with stakeholders to find different strategies which are effective but also adaptive to future conditions, as we understand more and more about what would future look like, and then somehow estimate the impacts and consequences, potential consequences of different governance strategies or different management strategies that we may take in the face of future conditions. So this is something from modeling perspective, but more important than this is the trade-off that we are facing when we want to, because I mentioned collaborating with stakeholders. So the trade-off that we face when we are engaging different stakeholders, different groups of stakeholders with different expertise, different backgrounds, and different knowledge of scientific and modeling or governing aspects. So we try, as researchers, we try to make things simpler or more understandable to a variety of ranges of stakeholders, but then that there's a trade-off, because we want to at the same time capture the complexity of a real world problem with the same modeling tools or same approach. So these two, I mean, this is kind of a trade-off that I think should be noticed here, in addition to all those things that we are trying to come up with a solution for, that how we want to include different stakeholders, decision makers, end users, people who are getting affected by different strategies, while we try to make them effectively contribute to the process, not only being a listener and just listening to what we are just presenting as results of our research. So I think I'll stop here and then I can talk.
Great, thank you, Leila. And last but not least, Graham.
Thanks, Phil, and welcome to the fellow panelists. Can you hear me okay? Just a thumbs up. Great. Today I'm talking from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people from Lake Simcoe Nottawasaga, Treaty 18. I've spent the last 6 days in Scugog Township, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, a sub-nation of the Mississauga Nation. And most of my work has happened in Saskatchewan, in the Saskatchewan River Delta, which is actually part of Treaty 6, 9, and 10. Sorry, 6, 5, and 10. And I think with respect to governance, the big challenge that I have seen in the last about 10 years of work in Canada is that we've made big improvements with respect to accessibility. So more people are able to participate in governance of water than maybe ever before. More people are interested, more people are trying to be a part of the debate. We've created various mechanisms to try and break down the barriers of communication. But where I think it falls down is that we've created so much accessibility, but we haven't complemented that expansion of accessibility with an expansion of responsiveness, which is making sure that we understand one another, and that before we make any big decisions, we're clear about what people we may be in conversation with mean when they're expressing themselves. And so that piece of responsiveness, I think, is really fundamental, because we have to make sure that I understand what you've said and that you understand what I've said, but also that based on what you've told me, here is what I would like to do about it, or here's an idea that I would like to propose as a way of responding to what you've told me. I think that's the missing piece in governance, in water governance in Canada, and maybe in other places in the world. I think we've seen that New Zealand is quite far ahead from the presentation this morning. And there are a few places that are adding a kind of new dimension to the way that we think about water, which is giving sort of life back to water and seeing it as a sort of living entity and not just a commodity or a resource to be, bought, sold, traded, adapted, however we want. And I think that's really important, because we're learning from especially Indigenous people in Canada and around the world that if we see water as a living entity, and we understand that if the water is healthy, then all the things that depend on water are healthy, then humans will also be healthy. But if those things that depend on water are not healthy, then humans will also not be healthy. So that's a maybe anthropogenic way of looking at it. But if we start to look at it from a more naturalistic, from a more, the value intrinsically of all those species that depend on water, it's going to be better for all life. And that's where I think this idea of responsiveness is really key. We don't just want to respond to the human side of water, but also to the natural side. So what are the ecosystems telling us is going wrong? And not just single species, many, many species, and the interactions between those species is central to this idea of responsiveness.
Super. Thank you, Graham. I appreciate that. And I'm seeing a number of really interesting cross-cutting ideas across all of your responses. I'll remind at this point, before I ask a follow-up, that I have in mind that anybody in the audience can pose questions to the panel. They'll come through to me, and I will pass them along. So please do, because we want this to be as driven by you and the audience as possible. You know, one of the things to the panel, one of the things that I heard, one of those sort of cross-cutting points, starting with Deborah, was, you know, this thinking about what is water. And Graham, you sort of brought us back to there, thinking about, you know, work that's been done to acknowledge and recognize and codify personhood for water, for example, its rights, its moral standing, and how that changes how we think about managing a commodity to building good relationships. And that's what I heard, Graham, you say when you talked about good relations. When I've been also thinking about the no panaceas and blind spots that you mentioned, Dustin. I think, again, if we are focusing on the relations that Graham is talking about, then we see those local particular features of issues that we're facing, and the local uncertainties. And then we can also engage in better relationships to be sure we're giving people the right information they need, the kind of information they consume, they can understand, helping them understand the information they need, which is something that I brought away from what you said, Leila. And so I'm really interested in this movement, which is global, to recognize the rights and personhood of water. And I'm curious to hear from all of your different perspectives. If you think about how we go about doing our science, our collaboration, creating our models, or suggesting improvements to policy, if, say, in Canada, water had legal personhood, which meant it, instead of treating it as a commodity or resource, that we had to have people who spoke on its behalf, where they would get that information. Graham, you talked about the relationships. I'm curious, what do you think it would mean for how we govern water in Canada, or perhaps as in relationships with other parts of the world as well, if we took that step here to acknowledge and recognize and codify the rights and personhood of water? And I'm opening that up to anybody who would like to start or has a thought about that. So I think it's a provocative but important, trajectory that some places are on. Graham?
Yeah, I think it's a great step forward to recognize rivers as either having personhood or even going a step further and saying that it's a community. You know, the river is a community, almost like a whole city, but it's not buildings and stoplights. It's a community of living beings. And I think that's the recognition that we're headed towards, and that we have a legal system that does recognize people as the sort of, the legal entity or corporations or other things. But I think if we took it even further to say, the river is a whole community of living things, and we want that community of living things to thrive as much as possible. I think the step that we're seeing now is towards personhood, because it's more in line with the existing legal system that recognizes individual people. But as we start to advance our understanding, which is very much combined with Indigenous knowledge of the relationships between all these entities, and the relationships between humans and non-humans and these entities, we can expand that framework to go even farther, to say, let's try to make sure that the whole community of the river, or rivers in many cases, is thriving, not just surviving, not just less bad, but actually thriving. And that's I think that's happening. The change that has been seen in the Whanganui in New Zealand is it's incredible, over a little less than a decade. And there's other rivers even in Europe that have gotten a lot cleaner through sort of more traditional policy mechanisms. And in the Great Lakes, we're seeing some improvements, but there's still so much work to be done. But by changing the way that we think about, the policy and the regulatory environment, it actually moves us forward much, much faster than simply trying to regulate individual chemicals, individual industries, individual people. But looking at it as an entire community, I think, is really where things are headed.
Thanks for that. I appreciate that answer. Deborah, I know you said that you have. Yeah.
It's a great question, and I appreciate the comments. And again, I'm looking at this from a particular lens. I guess the first thing I would say is Indigenous peoples already thought about waters kind of in that way, so I don't see personhood or rights of nature sort of. I mean, within the broader system, it is innovative and interesting, but in Indigenous system, it's sort of it's kind of about time. But there is still a number of tensions. One of them is that the rights of nature, rights of water, which I think they're working on with the Magpie over in northeastern Canada, is it's still within a colonial sort of legal system, and I would look at it as, well, what do Indigenous legal systems say about it? So I look at it kind of as an opportunity to have recognition of Indigenous legal orders and systems in Canada that already would have been engaging or coexisting in relation with the natural world, with the intention of sustainability and supporting all life anyway. And I'm not in any way saying it was perfect. I'm Anishinaabe. I know the stories, and we weren't, but we had, things happen, and we learned from that. And that's kind of part of the purpose of our stories and knowledge. So, but I do think it's going to create those kind of openings where we're going to start having those conversations when before we didn't. What are Indigenous legal traditions? Because even with the rights of nature, because it's still based on colonial sort of Canadian or common law, which, in New Zealand and Australia and other places, it's the British common law system. It still approaches the natural world as a separation from people, as opposed to not. We're all part of the same kind of system or living entity or community, as Graham said. So I do think we still need to. I approach that with caution. I go, okay, we already did that. How do we understand personhood? So someone like the great Josephine Mondawmin, who walked around all the Great Lakes, already said long before, she wasn't reading all this stuff on personhood or rights of nature. She just said each lake has its own personality, and trying to sort out what that would look like in consideration of Indigenous legal traditions actually would be interesting, because you have 6 nations, which is actually 6 nations, Anishinaabe, Menominee, other nations around the Great Lakes. But what it would do, as Graham pointed out, and others, is it would bring people into conversation with each other that maybe haven't been in conversation with each other. So I think what it does is it's going to open up, I hope, conversations around support for Indigenous legal traditions and how they play into these conversations around water governance and Indigenous knowledge systems. So that's what I'm hoping. And then again, start to bring forward what I call different ontologies of water, different ways that we're going to relate to water, other than being totally obsessed with always trying to manage and govern it. Because people have been doing that, and it doesn't appear to be kind of working out all that well, as far as I can tell, at every level. So we need to think differently about these things. And I think that conversation might poke some holes and get us going there.
I really, I appreciate that. I appreciate the all of those points from both of you. That every time I feel like more and more I see the emphasis on the individual in this other way of thinking about things, and focusing on relationships instead of governing. Deborah, that's a very compelling. Dustin, you had something you wanted to add.
Just a footnote, just to reinforce both of the comments and add one observation from Dr. Erin O'Donnell, who has done some work out of Melbourne University on legal personhood for rivers. And she points to this danger of personhood becoming a panacea in its own right, and the paradox of personhood, where more rights could come with less protection unless the personhood is paired with the cultivation, strengthening of the ethics, the perspective on relationality, some of the other points that have been mentioned. So I think it's important that we situate personhood alongside these broader moral and ethical imperatives, and also that we recognize that personhood is often going to be developed in a context of colonial, post-colonial context where economic systems, incentives are potentially pulling in other directions. So I think it's important that, you know, we account for that history and that context when we introduce these initiatives and the social mobilizations that they can bring.
I appreciate that, Dustin, and I think that you just sort of indirectly started an answer to one of the questions that we received about personhood being important but not necessarily sufficient, and needing to explicitly codify other aspects of rights and requirements and commitments to stewardship and healthy ecosystems. I appreciate that. Deborah, we did get a question from the audience. If you could offer an example to help people think a little bit more about how an Indigenous legal tradition might handle a water decision, a water governance dilemma.
So the example I'm going to draw on is the work of May Craft, because you can easily find her work. So she's a legal scholar, actually looking at these questions of personhood and rights in nature, traveling around the world, trying to figure out how this intersects with Indigenous legal traditions. One of them would be, so you wouldn't be trying to govern water in the system. You'd be trying to like coexist or be in relation to water. My ancestors wouldn't have been trying to do that for thousands of years. You would have been working with the nature of water. I think May did a good job with this as well. She started to document what actually water laws were, like that would literally emerge from the nature of water. And I don't know if it's surprisingly or unsurprisingly, but when you looked at the rights of the Magpie River in Labrador, the river that's being recognized as having rights in personhood, one of the first is that water must flow. So you don't stop water from flowing. Like, people have no business doing that. And people do with dams and other processes, right? So a decision would be, I don't have the right as a person to interfere with all the life that the water is supporting, and water itself, to stop its ability to be able to flow and do its job. So you would make a different decision in that situation. Of course, now there's lots of dams everywhere. So the appropriate decision would be then we have to, you know, and the initiative is happening, I guess, in other jurisdictions and other places in the world, is to take away the dam and have water flow again. Or when it's already happened, what is going to be, if we're going to harm water in some way as people, what is going to be our, how are we going to try to repair the relationship? What are we going to do for water to try to balance out that kind of relationship? What is it that we're going to do, instead of just assuming there's not going to be a consequence and we just get to do this? We actually have to think, what is it that we're going to do to repair this relationship with water? What's our reparation going to be in relation to water? So those are like, so different kinds of behavior and questions come up when you start thinking about water in that particular way. And Indigenous legal traditions would have guided us into that kind of decision making. And part of it is also recognizing, you'll hear lots of elders say this, they'll talk about natural law, that a lot of these entities or elements, because water is only one of them, have their own set of laws that we also need to understand and to respect. So that was just one of them that she talked about, and I wasn't surprised to see it when I saw the list that was in the Magpie River's like, water must flow. That's what it needs to do, and we shouldn't be interfering with that as people. So that's one example. I would suggest looking at her work more. She's done a lot of work in Northwestern Ontario with Treaty 3 in a lot of their declaration work, and what this can look like with the intention of trying to create broader awareness and education around what this looks like. So hopefully that was helpful to you.
Yeah, I think so. I think those are very good. That's a very good concrete understanding. Even just the language, shifting in the language from governance language, controlling language, to relating language, I think is such an important change in disposition. I'm not seeing more questions come in just yet, so maybe I will dig into my own bag of tricks for another one. We've mentioned in the the introduction and the setup for this panel, uncertainty, and Leila, you brought up uncertainty and the challenges that uncertainty face with particular models, but also communication. And so I was curious, I'm curious to hear you, Leila, and maybe others talk about an uncertainty that you find particularly troubling and what you think we ought to do about it.
So when we're talking about modeling and uncertainty, and for now, I assume that we keep going with governing, because right now I'm modeling the ways that we are deciding for water, not assuming that water, not living with water. So I'm just, my apologies for just keep continuing with that literature for now, with the language for now. But just from uncertainty perspective, I would say that the most, apart from uncertainty that is associated with different variables, like climate variables, when we are dealing with futures or future conditions, there are some other even more perhaps severe types of uncertainty, which has to do with the human involvement. So when we have different stakeholders with different interests in a river system, how and there is ambiguity always about even among themselves what is that they want from this river system. What are the values for water among each of these groups? And as Graham mentioned at the beginning, so we hear something coming from them, but then how we can incorporate those in our decision-making process, that is the big question. So usually they refer to it as deep uncertainty. So when we cannot even agree among decision makers, analysts, different groups of stakeholders about what is uncertain and how uncertain that variable is. So everything about it is kind of confusing. So I just found that particular element, just when human gets involved in decision making, more challenging, because we have some methods, mathematical methods, probabilistic methods to deal with local uncertainty, which is the uncertainty that we use to account for like climate variables and other things. But then when we move towards those areas where human gets involved, and we have some sort of other types of confusions or unknown factors entering the equation, then that might cause some sort of and that gets back to what I said, the trade-off between having our models being getting them understandable for different stakeholders, and then at the same time capturing the complexity of the system.
Right. Anybody else want to talk about an uncertainty that you're particularly uncertain about? Or a blind spot, Dustin?
I'll bite on the blind spot. And I think one of the issues that I could have mentioned around the challenges is that the boundaries of water challenges and the ways in which those challenges are actually created and addressed are far beyond water. And I think that's been a cross-cutting theme that's come in the discussion so far. In the context of my work, I spend a lot of time focused on the collision, the competition, the conflict, as well as the potential cooperation and benefit sharing between cities and agriculture. And this has drawn my attention to how aspects of food systems and global food value chains in particular influence, the patterns of water challenges and some of the issues around that. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's an uncertainty, but I do think we need to better account for the impacts of these other systems in our decision-making around water, and recognize that a lot of our decision-making around water is outside of, what people talk about as the water box. So again, it's not necessarily uncertainty, but I think it is a blind spot. The other, I guess, blind spot that I would draw attention to is the power and capacity for informal responses to water challenges. A lot of our frameworks and indicators for assessing governance capacity and gaps are ignoring the informal sector, small water enterprises, local and rural systems, non-state actors who are involved in these processes. Now, most of my work is outside of Canada, but one prime example of this is in the context of the SDG Sustainable Development Goal around clean drinking water, where there's growing prevalence of informal sector and actually contributing to meeting this need. And so the development of water governance models that fails to account for this informal sector and the role that it can play in broadening access to safe drinking water, I think is really a big problem that we have to be addressing. So again, not an example of uncertainty, but something that is lying in plain sight, and we need to do a better job of recognizing and then acknowledging and then building on.
Thank you for that, Dustin. And it's moved me in a little bit in a direction of another question that we've received that raises the quote unquote, do we need behavioral change as well, with reference to waste practices, urban and industrial practices? But building on the conversation so far, what it's got me thinking is whether or not we've created a bit of a false separation between the way we understand it, that there's a system that does the governing, that creates the rules, and that there's a system of behavior that either follows or breaks the rules. And I'm curious. I want to ask this question, how do we understand behaviors that are contrary to healthy water, clean water, water security? But then is there an opportunity to maybe rethink how we rethink this model that we have of there's the governance over here, and then there's the uses and the incentives over here? If there's a question in there, I hope that there is, and I'm curious to hear how some of you might respond to that. Graham, yeah.
I'll give it a go. So I want to back up for one moment and say something I've learned a lot through Global Water Futures, and particularly as we shift to trying to find an inclusive language around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And like, just for example, even the term blind spot, I've learned just in the last 2 months is not an enabling language. We could say a gap in our knowledge, something that we don't see. There's this language that's developing very quickly that's new to many of us, especially me. I come to this with a huge amount of privilege, so say that, and I'm learning this, and this isn't to like say anyone did anything wrong at all, but only to recognize that when we talk about water, there's a new language emerging about how we talk about water. And uncertainty is the same kind of thing. Uncertainty is a big deal in hydrology, in water resources. It's fundamental, trying our best to deal with uncertainty. And yet when we talk to people who are maybe not directly involved in hydrology or water resources, uncertainty them is very different. So it's trying to find what is a common language around uncertainty. Well, it's the things that we don't know. The things that we have, that we don't know, and we're sort of pretty sure, but there's still some uncertainty here. There's still some things that we don't know, and we're trying to get better. And I think that's really tough because people's understanding of uncertainty is so different. And we don't spend enough time sort of talking about how it's different and trying to understand one another's knowledge about uncertainty and which uncertainties are important and which ones aren't. And so again, I think it's that responsiveness piece is we have to do a lot more. I've learned so much from Saman Razavi and Carl Eric Lindenschmidt and previously Howard and John about the way that they understand uncertainty. It's fundamentally different from the way I do. And they would probably say the same about all the people that they've worked with. So I think it's trying to come to that commonplace, but recognizing that we're not going to get there quickly, and that it takes this sort of dialogue, which is sort of messy and sometimes argumentative, because some of us might think, no, I understand what uncertainty means, and that other person, no, they don't really understand. I think that's fundamentally wrong. I think we all have kind of different understandings of words, and uncertainty is a big one in water science, that we need to find a way of making that technical uncertainty more inclusive, and bringing the the other types of uncertainty, like the things that we don't know, into the space. And I want to go back to something Deborah said, because she's absolutely right, that this new way of thinking about relationships or personhood of rivers, or the sort of thriving life, is a very old idea that we're relearning in the sciences. Indigenous people knew this for forever, and then it was settler communities that moved around and created these institutions that forgot what it was like to be relational to a place, and not just to like the land, but to all of the things that impact that land. And through these discussions that we've had in Global Water Futures and beyond in the last few years, people are really kind of coming into this new way of thinking, and that alone has a great amount of uncertainty. Where is it going to take us? I think it's really exciting. I've just listening to the conversations today, I feel like, wow, how lucky are we that we get to be in the middle of it, as this sort of new awakening is happening, this like real, like sincere effort to understand each other. That's, I think, the challenge. Like, that's the great uncertainty, is what's going to come out of it all. I just think it's so exciting.
That's thanks for that, Graham. It's a really good point, and I'm glad you moved us in the direction of something that excites us. The antidote, it strikes me, to uncertainty are relationships, and the more diverse the relationships, the more diverse ways of knowing people are bringing, and experiences and tools and practices and wisdom, the more we can reduce that uncertainty collectively. So I think we've gone a little full circle here in this. We have just but 3 minutes left, and keeping with that theme for the end of something that you're excited about, if anybody has, instead of talking about the problems or the gaps or what have you, if there's something that you're particularly pleased, that's encouraging to you in terms of our ability to do things different, better, more equitable moving forward. Whoever wants to have the last word, just raise your hand. Yeah, Deborah.
Yeah, I was just going to build on that and also respond a bit to the question on systemic behavioral changes. I think what I'm looking for, if we can all agree that the business as usual and to tweaking it to business as usual and trying to build better tools to understand the business as usual, which isn't getting us to anything more sustainable, actually. I think that's what all the disaster reports say. I just call them the disaster reports that keep coming out, just telling us what in worse shape we are, like every time a report comes out, is the transformation that they call for. So how do these conversations, how does engaging with different worldview and ontology, understanding and values of water or life around us, engaging with different people, like some of the projects that are being talked about here at this conference are with youth and people on the land. How does that get us, like, how does that spark our imagination to imagine a different kind of future? Like, how does that lead us into this transformative change? I sort of think, like, I'm kind of old, so I kind of think young people sort of inherited these problems that maybe my generation and older created. So how do we start like passing on like solutions and knowledge that's going to enable more creativity and imagination and transformation? So that's what I'm looking forward to. And again, there's uncertainty in that. I have no idea. All I know is what's going on right now isn't working. So what are we going to do to make it, like, what are we going to do to transform, and all the pain that's going to cause, because change is hard for people, in order to get us somewhere that's, imaginative. Like, I'm happy to hear other people's ideas and try to figure out how to make them happen. I'm not terribly imaginative myself. So I'm happy about these conversations about different values that are coming into play, and lots of cool things happening on the ground that we then take up and try to push forward. So that's what I would add. They've been calling for this, but we haven't delivered on it. So what does that look like, and what can we do to enable that to happen?
That's a fantastic way to close out this session. Thank you so much for that, Deborah. Thanks to all of you for the opportunity to chat with you briefly about this. I hope that, I'm sure that everybody in the audience enjoyed it as much as I did. I believe that's the end of our time. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. But thank you all.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Michael was having trouble getting in. It says that the stage is full or something like that.
Oh.
Okay, he should be able to get in now. Okay.
Wow.
Text him.
There's always room for Michael on stage.
Of course.
I know.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank
We all
you
know
so much.
Emily's doing yeoman service here. She's not well, but she looks surprisingly lively.
Yeah, it's amazing what your advice can do, Oliver. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining. It's a pleasure to have you all here today. So just to start off, I'm lucky enough to know all of you, but I'd love to introduce you to the audience one by one. If you can talk about what you're doing and what you're currently doing to help with the Canada Water Agency as we wait with bated breath for its announcement in the coming week or 2 weeks. John, I'll throw it to you first. If you can just do a quick introduction.
Okay, my name is John Pomeroy. I'm a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, a hydrologist by training, and director of the Global Water Futures Program. And so, I guess for the last 8 years, I've been discussing with federal officials about the need for a Canada Water Agency because of the water crisis that Canada is entering, and part of our adaptation as a country to better address the major issues and challenges that water is posing towards people who live in Canada as a result of extreme weather and water events, and as well as some of our lack of and loss of capacity and poor management decisions in the past.
Thank you. And we'll move on. Michael, can you tell us about your past?
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Miltenberger. I'm calling from Fort Smith in the Northwest Territories. One of my past occupations was I was a member of the Legislative Assembly in the Northwest Territories for 20 years and did 14 as a minister. 9 of those years I was Minister of the Environment. And did a lot of work with folks around this table. And now I've moved on. I have my own business and I do work with the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources, and I'm part of the Collaborative Leadership Initiative. But in this case, most importantly, I've been a member of FLOW for the last 5 or 6 years, and FLOW has been a major proponent for the Canada Water Agency.
Thank you, Michael. And the same breath, I'll ask Merrell-Ann, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Merrell-Ann Phare. I'm calling you from Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm about 100 meters from the Red River, which is just this high from the banks. I am a lawyer. I am with the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. I'm also a commissioner with the International Joint Commission, and I'm a member of FLOW. And Michael and I have worked together in the Northwest Territories, negotiating transboundary water agreements. And so my interest in the Canada Water Agency is around the nature of collaboration, governments collaborating in an innovative way, which is a key opportunity for the agency.
Thank you. I'll also say that Michael and Merrell-Ann host a fantastic podcast called The Porcupine that I would highly recommend taking a listen to. And Oliver, I'll send it to you next.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Oliver Brandis. I'm here at the mouth of the Colquitts Creek on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people, known as the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Masonic communities. And for that, I'm thankful. My background is much like many of the panelists here, a little bit diverse. I'm a lawyer and economist by training. I have done some work on ecological restoration. I'm at the University of Victoria, where I lead a variety of programs at both the Center for Global Studies and at the Polis Project on ecological governance focused on water. Similar to some of the folks, I've been on the Forum for Leadership on Water, so FLOW, since its inception, really, and I'm currently the chair. And we've been very interested, both in my sort of university-based work and as part of FLOW, in really strengthening, starting with understanding and then strengthening the federal role on water as part of a comprehensive set of solutions. And that's really kind of where my interest lies: law, institution, governance reform as a key piece in having a solutions and more resilient approach to our ecological conundrums.
Amazing. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm Emily. So I'm the coordinator at FLOW, the Forum for Leadership on Water. And just for our audience today, how we're going to structure the panel is that each of our panelists will have one question that they ask directly. Then we'll have about 20 minutes, 15 to 20, to have an open discussion. So please send us any questions you have throughout the conversation. I'll be happy to ask them towards the end of the panel. So just to really start, we're going to go straight to John and ask, what are the gaps in research, science, and data and prediction in Canada that the Canada Water Agency could address and address well?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, this has really been what has motivated my interest in the Canada Water Agency, and there are a number of things that, from a scientific perspective, that an agency needs to do, because these simply aren't happening right now. One is to create and then to mobilize the knowledge that is needed to predict and respond to water problems and changing water opportunities. Of course, Canada's economy and ecosystems are water-based, so it's not always problems, it's sometimes opportunities. But right now, if you wanted to collect all the information on water in Canada, you would have a terrible, terrible time trying to do this, because you would find the water quantity information well archived by the Water Survey of Canada. You would find some federal water quality information from the research branch in Environment Canada, others from provincial agencies. You would find groundwater archived by Natural Resources Canada and the provinces, and you would have great difficulty finding snow or ice information on the ground. You'd find it through various ad hoc informations. If you try to find predictions of future floods and droughts and water supply and water quality, you would find that, at least for what's publicly available, these tend to come from the provinces, but it's quite spotty. So some provinces have forecast and prediction simulation systems and some don't. Some are using spreadsheets, some are not using any numerical methods. And so there's tremendous variability across the country. This puts us at a tremendous disadvantage. Really the only G7 country that doesn't have this comprehensive database and ability to predict. But also we're being hit by floods constantly in this country. The November floods in British Columbia were staggering and not well predicted. The floods of the spring from Ontario through the Prairie provinces to the Northwest Territories. Again, that's now 5 jurisdictions, but really dealing with one system through there, and tremendous similarities to these floods of late-lying deep snowpacks, rain, and then ice jams in the rivers. So these are crucial things. The agency as well needs to be dealing with some aspects of climate change, adaptation, flood damage reduction and risk mapping, determining beneficial management practices, and aspects of soil and water conservation. There's so much that we can do, but this takes a strong scientific basis, a strong technical basis to the agency, and understanding that Canada is a confederation, working with the provinces, territories, and bringing the First Nations into this to work in a way to share data and knowledge in a fashion that simply hasn't happened before. And everything we've seen today in the Global Water Futures meeting suggests that the broader base of knowledge and a more holistic approach is absolutely essential for this. And only a federal agency can do this. And it would have to be an agency with really exciting, novel ideas about how to bring this information together. And that's how we'll find solutions as a country for the water crisis that we're in. But right now, we lack this. We lack that federal capacity. We have tremendous fragmentation federally, provincially, territorially. And the programs that have tried to bring it together, such as Global Water Futures, they come and go. Global Water Futures starts to end next year, and its capacity won't be there to help. So this needs the longevity and the steady hand that only a federal agency can give. I look at the Public Health Agency of Canada and how incredibly useful that information from that was during the pandemic, and look towards the Canada Water Agency for the next big floods and droughts that come. So thank you.
Thank you, John. It's actually very interesting because I saw today that NASA's photo of the day was the Red River flooding in Manitoba. And it's very interesting that that's coming from NASA instead of a Canadian source. So awful picture of the day, but very interesting nonetheless. So Michael, I want to go to you. With your extensive knowledge and experience working in the North, are there any kind of ideas or stories that you can share with us that can build upon a successful Canadian water agency that you've seen work in the Northern Territories?
I got a few. So I'd just like to point out first, of course, that in the Northwest Territories, we've learned for a long time now that we're in the middle of a global climate and water crisis, and we're heavily, heavily impacted. We've learned very early on now that the status quo is not working. And most clearly, we've learned that no one government can go it alone in solving any kind of problems of this magnitude. And that in the North, after beating our heads against the status quo wall for a long time, we finally realized when it came to writing, for example, bills of very significant importance, like the Wildlife Act, that we had to engage fully with Indigenous governments. And we've taken that approach with water, we've taken that approach with legislation, where we've mapped out our way forward together, recognizing that the role of governments is to create the conditions to solve problems, and recognizing that Indigenous governments have jurisdiction, they have constitutionally referenced, protected, and they have rights that are in the Constitution. And similarly, when we go to the national table, that situation is there as well. You can't solve the problems. This is not just a federal problem. Water is a national issue, and every government that has jurisdiction has to have a way to bring that jurisdiction to the table, like we tried to do in the North, to work together to try to solve, as we did through collaboration, and what I would think is some very concrete ways of co-governance, like writing laws, to be able to try to solve those problems. Otherwise, we are where we are, and things are not looking good if we don't make these changes like the Canada Water Agency.
Thank you. Kind of going off of that, Merrell-Ann, can you kind of delve more into the role of co-governance in an independent Canada Water Agency, especially how it's going to change against the current status quo?
Sure, I can try. So we have an approach in Canada, cooperative federalism, and the reason we have that approach is because our Constitution, the Canadian Constitution, started by having really clear lines of authority for federal and provincial governments, and our nation was founded on, in theory, these two founding nations. The idea of co-governance starts from the recognition of a couple of things. First, it wasn't just two founding nations. There were Indigenous nations, many of them that were here as Canada was being built and were largely ignored, but were critical to the country moving forward. And yet we know the history of Canada, where they've been kind of dispossessed and have had to fight very hard to get back recognition of their rights, their inherent authorities, etc. Our system, though, hasn't really adapted to being able to integrate those authorities into the way the country is governed. Cooperative federalism is still really the federal and provincial and territorial governments coming together at a table
somewhere, or creating laws that kind of complement each other, work together, do not step on each other's toes, because that's the way that governments work. They are turfy in that way, very clear about whose jurisdiction is what, but they will sometimes work together to have things work together. And that's really what cooperative federalism is. When we talk about co-governance, we're talking about changing the laws and the policies and the structures that are about governing this country and changing them collaboratively. Oliver and I have often talked about this concept of bending the beams. We each have institutions we've got to move to a middle, to a place, and people like Danica Littlechild have talked about an ethical space, and Stephen Nita from the Northwest Territories, this idea of we need to come to a common ethical space in the middle where we actually bring our jurisdictions to the table, all of us, and figure out what's the solution we can each have a piece of to implement based on the jurisdictions we have. And the key part about that, though, is without having to fight about those jurisdictions first. Because there's an argument to be made that we do some of that in some ways. But most often what it takes for, particularly the involvement of Indigenous nations, is a lengthy court battle. We've got to go all the way to the Supreme Court it takes a career or two or what have you, and to prove that there are some basic right that they have that involves the right to make a decision about it. And then you're back to the table. Okay, so you have the right recognized in the Western legal system, the colonial system. Now what? And so the whole challenge we have is to try to, I find, leapfrog over that 20-year battle and come to the table and maybe agree to disagree on certain things, but still do the thing you want to do together anyway. And there are examples in Canada where we have done this, and Michael and I were both involved in the negotiation of a protected area, a very large protected area, almost 35,000 square kilometers in the Northwest Territories, called Thai-Dene-Nene. It's an Indigenous conserved and protected area led by the Litzelkay First Nation and Parks Canada and the government of the Northwest Territories. And they have a collaborative governance agreement that sets out the arrangement to protect this massive area. It's the size of Belgium, it's huge, but according to Indigenous principles, and it's dealing with land. It's a hard issue. It's not, right? It's a physical issue. It's a huge section of the Northwest Territories. And yet they were able to collaborate to create this binding approach to dealing with this territory. And it's that kind of novelty where you can, Steve Nita often says, collaborative governments is we agree to disagree and then move on to the thing we want to do. And so getting to yes through kind of agreeing on that we don't agree. And so that's what I think that we need to do. The main driver for this, of course, is that there are at least two massive issues that are above, as Michael said, above the role of any one government to deal with, supra-state kind of issues. One is climate change, of course. No one government can figure this out. And also the issues of reconciliation and the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Both of those require multiple governments to come together in order to actually address. And so we have to try to find ways to evolve our governance approaches in Canada to deal with those realities.
Thank you. And finally, Oliver, in addition to the Canada Water Agency, which I think many of us know is not a standalone project by any means, what would an updated Canada Water Act look like, and how would it interact with the agency?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll take a step back and just highlight some of the points of emphasis. And that's my roundabout way of saying, well, what will the act give us, right? I mean, legislation or governance reform is really a question of what is it we want, right? So it's a form follows function question. And I think there's a couple of key points that are worth really emphasizing, right? We've all learned that the climate crisis is a water crisis. I think Michael emphasized that point. And certainly, for me on the West Coast, it's deadly obvious. We were sort of at the apex of a bunch of climate that manifested in a water way. At Polis, we often talk about the 4 horsemen of the water apocalypse, right? Flood, fire, drought, and drinking water failure. Well, all 4 arrived with a mighty stampede. And I think the point is we were ill-equipped to respond, right? Many will say, wow, what a shock. How can we expect such things? And that is the issue. It really wasn't unexpected. I mean, John pointed that out. We know, maybe you could argue it's happening faster than many of us imagined. But again, the idea that it was going to happen was without a doubt. So this is about, in a way, the theme that both Merrell-Ann and Michael were talking about, which is like getting our house in order, right? Getting ourselves organized to be able to respond. And in our society and the way we work, laws, policy, governance matter a lot. So that's really, it isn't just a sort of carbon management problem or even a hydrogen and oxygen, right? Water. It's actually where these things intermingle with society and we braid together. So that's where the response question. So I'm giving you a little bit of a context to say, okay, we're going to take this seriously. We need the federal government to be an active player in this. So, for example, the role of the Canada Water Agency as an independent and strong body that can build those effective partnerships and collaborations, that can meaningfully embody co-governance and enable it, is really fundamental. As Merrell-Ann suggests, we're sort of underutilizing. We're not connecting to the key governing pillars. But the Act is another one of those really important pieces because, the Act is 50 years old. So that's one thing that should be an early warning sign for us, because you can imagine what the world, or at least Canada, looked like 50 years ago. I mean, many on this call probably weren't even alive. For me, I just recently celebrated my 50th birthday. And so 50 years seems like quite a long time. And we know it was pretty good at dealing with some of the issues of the day, but we really have something that's pretty outdated. So when I think about what role the Canada Water Agency might play, at a minimum, it needs to modernize this really important element or pillar of governance for the country. I think there's some really positive things we can draw from the history, of something like the Canada Water Act. It set up these comprehensive studies and planning initiatives, just 2 examples, Okanagan and St. John's River. It helped enable some flood damage reduction programs, through mapping and discouraging some of this vulnerable investment. Hey, that's a theme. 50 years ago was relevant. Well, it seems pretty relevant today again. Collaborative hydrometric agreements, and that's just one small element. I think John, in a much more sophisticated way, talks about the kinds of science and knowledge systems. In addition, how we want to layer in Indigenous knowledge and authority in that mix. Water quality monitoring agreements. There's another high point. And the catalyst to some of these interjurisdictional water boards, for example, the Prairie Provinces and Mackenzie River Basin boards, as 2 examples, are some of the high points. But that's sort of like a minimum standard. Like, we as Canadians, and certainly us working in the field, have almost forgotten that the federal government has any relevant role in these things because they're so absent that they're not even really seen as a player. And we need to rebuild that. And so that brings me to the kind of like, so what would the 21st century version of that Water Act, aside from building on some of those strengths, embedding a co-governance piece, ensuring that we have some of the science in place, that we create some of those funding connections? I think of a few other pieces. River basin level agreements and plans to implement those agreements. The power to proactively, and that's the key, proactively. We can't just respond to these crises. I'm going to bring you back to my BC story to start. We can't chase these disasters because we can't actually afford it as a society. Not only the loss of life and valuable, but to rebuild it will be impossible in the same way unless we build in a much more resilient way. So we have to think about the kinds of basin level standards, minimum environmental assessment, flows, quality and quantity components. Those are just going to be some of the basic elements. We have to get beyond this notion of the federal government as far as this kind of act just coming in under emergency power, but the broader sense of nation building and some of that proactive elements that helps us build an infrastructure that's a very different kind of infrastructure. It's an institutional infrastructure. It's an infrastructure of knowledge and the ability to respond, the ability to provide incentives, to change behavior, to build resilience for drought, to make sure that we have some water available, but that we're rebuilding and restoring aquifers at the same time. That's credible, right? So that we can see a legitimate role for the Crown and Indigenous governments working together for good governance. This co-governance agreements, and I have the personal experience from the BC DRIPA, which is the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which is our British Columbia legislation that basically enables UNDRIP, and that elements of those could exist in a modernized Canada Water Act that basically allows us to recognize Indigenous governing authorities and to build those kinds of partnerships. And I'll just end with a couple of my sort of favorite innovations. When we talk about law can innovate, can create incentives for new ways of thinking. Merrell-Ann talked a bit about it, but the idea of making reconciliation real through a co-drafting process. So the act of making the new legislation can build reconciliation as we co-draft and bring multiple viewpoints, multiple authorities together. The notion of the public trust doctrine, the idea that we hold water, the Crown, in much of Canada, we exert it as a Crown ownership. That's probably the wrong frame when we're dealing with an uncertain world and a co-governance model. Environmental flow protection is much more than just minimum water quality standards or the minimum flow in a river. It's about a whole sophisticated network that includes riparian, timing of flow, water quality components, the idea of enabling better water-land planning. The interconnection of water and land is so critical, and we think about any activities on the landscape inevitably ends up in the water. And we have to break out of the notion that water law is about managing the water in the water column alone, or the amount of water we take out of the water column, but it's part of an integrated whole. And that's where these notions of watershed governance, basin governance begin to come in. And this is what you would embody in a modernized Canada Water Act.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I think you all, Merrell and Oliver especially, you made law seem a little bit easier to our audience. So thank you. I do have a question specifically for Merrell-Ann and Michael. Do you think that there's an increased interest in collaborative governance in the last few years? Notably looking at, I think the public in Canada has in some ways woken up to the urgency of reconciliation in many different ways. And I just wonder if you think this has trickled down in all forms of governance, that collaboration is necessary and people would like to do it.
I'll defer to Merrell-Ann to start.
I have absolutely, definitely seen a lot more interest in the subject and in the approach, particularly with the implementation of UNDRIP and acts like DRIPA, et cetera. I think people are trying to figure out, what does consent mean? What does Indigenous governance mean? How do you implement Indigenous laws? How do you respect inherent authorities? And we have to know that at the end of the day, this comes down to human decision-making. It comes down to somehow sitting at a table together and figuring out what happens next. And what gets in the way, though, is I think we have fairly outmoded ideas of what jurisdiction means and what you're allowed or not allowed to do with it. And I've seen like really narrow conceptions of, well, we can't sit at a table and talk about something because that, in legal parlance, that's called fettering the minister. You take away the authority of the minister to decide on something. And what I've often said is, no, you can bring your jurisdiction to the table and we can work on what you'll do and what we'll do. And that's actually called collaboration. And then our own systems, Indigenous, municipal, provincial, territorial, federal, go back and enshrine it or get it approved in your own world. But you're all working towards a goal you developed collaboratively. And that's why I actually call it collaborative governance. You're not infringing on each other's jurisdictions or stepping on each other, but you're choosing to implement them in a way towards a common goal that is actually life-affirming. It provides greater, stability for the future. It actually protects us to the greatest extent possible. And so I've seen a lot of that. conversation, and also a lot of stumbling about where people are not really sure how to do it yet. I think we're in a super exciting phase of this conversation, because it really comes down to what are the creative, imaginative structures we can think of. And the Canada Water Agency is exactly in that boat. It's exactly in the moment of going, a Canada Water Agency, the word agency means agent. It means you have the ability to act, to do something, to have agency, right? And so how can we work together to create that institution so that it can do something for all of Canada nationally? And that's just the most important conversation. And the jury's still not out yet in terms of how that will end up, and just how much agency that institution will have, and how pivotal a role it will end up playing in the future of Canada's water security.
So just very quickly, in the few seconds I got left, just a comment that in the North, into my mind, after all my years on this planet, it's the only way forward, the way to water, to deal with any other issue, health, economy, is through co-governance. And what we have before us is a challenge of the politics is moving a lot faster than the entrenched bureaucracies that have been in place for the last 154 years. And the political will comes in, and the change is agreed to. Then you have to deal with the institutions and the bureaucracies that have been set for 154 years to protect the status quo, to take care of the day-to-day business, to not move very fast. And it's a very difficult time. It's a critical time, which is why we need a new Canada Water Act. And it's why things like co-drafting of legislation is so problematic, or setting up an independent agency like the Canada Water Agency, because there's significant internal resistance from the entrenched bureaucracies that have been created in our country that are very, very slow to change. So it's a struggle, but it is happening, and the politics and I think the awareness of the people is there. And now we just have to keep applying ourselves to get it done.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a huge question. It's good to have some sense of hope in looking forward. So I think that's a great way to continue this conversation. We do have a few questions from the audience. So one, kind of in lieu of the last question, is the UK Climate Change Act mandated the creation of an independent advisory board, the UKCCC. The UK government, by law, must incorporate committee recommendations into climate change policy. Could this work in Canada?
Well, I'll take the bait. Can it work in Canada? Of course it can work. There's many ways you can arrange it. I think I think we can draw on lots of examples, and I think most of the panelists would agree here. What Canada has been lacking is any sort of gumption or any follow through on these issues. So we could arrange it about a dozen different ways, and it would be a net improvement, because we've really been quite lackluster. And I would argue the wake-up call came last summer. Certainly for British Columbia it did. And you could see there how the provincial government reorganized itself, has a new watershed security fund as part of a commitment. There needs to be a financial element, an agency that, like federally now, that can actually follow through. So as Merrell-Ann talks about, not just coordinating, not just advising, but doing some of the work. What's missing is the federal activity on the landscape, helping us to not only arrange and make choices, but also building the kinds of new approaches, new incentives, so that we're out of the status quo. So yes, absolutely something that could work. But I think we could be even more creative than that, frankly.
Yeah. The idea of a federal water security officer advised by a panel like that with some teeth, where they could take some suggestions for ensuring water security for Canada, which we're not anywhere close to meeting right now, and something that would be enforceable and binding upon the minister or ministers that have responsibility for various water portfolios would be a very powerful thing. And it would help us avoid the sleepwalking we've been doing as we walk in this hypnotic trance into a climate disaster that's destroying our communities, right? And then you wake up and your town is burnt down or has been flooded, or your crops are destroyed because of drought, or then flooding the next season, and pretty soon you're living somewhere else, wondering what happened. And it takes that kind of teeth to unfortunately force us from the very complacent attitude that we have, that, oh, we're Canadians, we have 20% of the world's fresh water, it behaves just fine, it's there when we want it and away when we don't. That world's gone. And this, as part of our adaptation to the rest of the century, because it's going to get worse, we've got to have something with that level of teeth to it.
I think something that's always stood out for me with the Canada Water Agency has been that this is an opportunity for Canada to show leadership in this sector and not just follow suit of what is slightly working for other countries. So I think in that way, it's a very exciting thing to monitor internationally as well. We have another question. This is primarily aimed at you, John, I believe. Since there is a lack of predictive data, is there also a lack of qualitative data? And the person asked in terms of cultural, emergency response, human health, and etc.
Yes, there is. The predictive data, as we noted, is not there, but the qualitative information is extremely important in determining what resolution types of predictive data can be helpful. For instance, if you have a drought warning system, but it's set up in such a way, or society's structured in such a way that no one's going to respond to a drought warning, then why have it? So you need to have that the social systems and information there, along with the physical, economic, and culture and ecological information, and piece these together in order to create effective information and response systems across the country. And unfortunately, we lack that as well. So there's a lot of work to be done by a new agency to do things that are truly innovative and effective.
Okay.
And Emily, if I could just add to that, because when John was talking about the kinds of things that we don't have in terms of information and data, one of the things that at least the Canadian government, the federal government doesn't do, and I don't think many provincial governments, if any, do either, is you couldn't go anywhere to find water quality really or quantity data as in a river that moves through Indigenous territory, for example, unless Indigenous people are doing it themselves. And it's certainly not integrated within any federal data sets or anything like that. I remember the federal government was called out by the Auditor General a number of years back about the fact that that kind of gap existed. And I'm not even talking about Indigenous knowledge yet. And I know there are many really interesting initiatives across Canada. They're dealing with trying to capture that data, work with Indigenous communities doing their own work, the Indigenous Guardians program, et cetera, things like that, right? But you could see how if you wanted to envision new structures that Canada needs to be resilient, one of them is strong Indigenous institutions that produce their own information and can work collaboratively with other institutions to get the broader regional picture of what's going on in the system that's impacting them, right? And so imagine if you have the Canada Water Agency with a headquarters somewhere in Canada, preferably outside of Ottawa, and then a series of regional hubs that were in critical basins, maybe one in every of the large basins, but also there were Indigenous hubs to that institution, right? Where there was local support for building Indigenous water institutions and authorities and data production, et cetera. That would be truly, wonderful and part of what's needed for the full place of Indigenous people in the governance of Canada, right? There's strong institutions. And so that's both on the science side and on the governance side. And so just wanted to point out that would be a practical application of the way the agency could actually be structured, and it's how its programs could roll out that would be of use at multiple levels.
Maybe let me just add
for a quick. So I just want to add one comment about data versus information. I was involved when I was a minister with putting in a fiber optic link up north because we have satellites circling over Inuvik, and they dump big loads of data hourly almost. There's so many satellites. But what I learned as minister is points of data, unless they're converted to usable information that can be put to use and given to politicians or managers or corporate people, the data by itself is of no value. So the key is taking that data and getting that data that John talks about and convert it into information, in my case, where it was always very important trying to get that kind of information as a politician. So the distinction between data and information is a very critical one.
Maybe I'll just add a point of punctuation here just to drive home the themes here that I'm hearing. You know, we talk a bit about federal leadership. What we're mostly talking about is getting federal government back up to a passing grade, right? So part of what we're talking about is just catching up. And if we want to really talk about leadership, I think there's 4 simple themes, and we've touched on them all here, right? The federal government could actually lead in creating and mobilizing the knowledge needed to predict and respond to the water problems. So that's one piece, and that's that data and knowledge going further. There's a really important role for strengthening transboundary water management and cooperative federalism. That's missing, and only the federal government can do that. They could lead there. There's this piece that Merrell-Ann's touched on, and Michael as well, strengthening reconciliation with Indigenous people, but that's through actual co-governance, through shared authority and multiple knowledge systems and multiple approaches. And finally, and that's certainly from my perspective, one of the most important pieces, which is improving those collaborative river basin planning and the results, the consequences. We don't want plans that just sit on a shelf, but plans that have consequences. That means you can and can't do certain things. And if you do, there's consequences. So those simple 4 bundle of pieces is where the federal government could lead. And they touch on all the themes we've touched on today.
Thank you, Oliver. I think that's a really great synopsis for the whole hour. 45 minutes. I know we could go on for a long time. We do have a few minutes left, and I want to kind of end on a good note. I think I learned this from Merrell-Ann in a conference beforehand, and also from the panel before us as well. But just for everyone in short sentences, how can the greater water community in Canada really come together to support the Canada Water Agency in its infancy? So notably in those different sections that Oliver, that you raised, so in data and information and collaboration and co-governance. So I just want to pass that to all of you.
Could I, just starting, the one thing that we could help immediately with some of the legacies from Global Water Futures. One is co-developing with Indigenous communities, water solutions in various areas. The other is looking from a river basin approach to problem solving in Canada. The development of what I believe are the most sophisticated flood, drought, and water prediction models in the world. Why aren't we applying them in Canada? The United States will be applying them very soon. So we better get our act together and get them going here. But also data management systems. We've tried to compile all the human, cultural, quantitative, qualitative water quality, chemistry, ecology data into GWF-net in a respectful way. Some of these are examples or prototypes that could be deployed by Canada Water Agency. We've built up this tremendous capacity in Canada, and we'd love to hand over that capacity to this agency to give it a boost as it moves forward. And this is, the timing is right now.
So my suggestion, of course, is political slant. Is people have to talk to their elected representatives. There's federal, provincial, territorial tables that should be expanded to include Indigenous governments. But every MP, every MLA, every minister should be talking to Canada to say, do all the things we've been talking about here, do it with us, that we can all do this together, and it has to be done now.
Thank you. We only have a minute left, so I want to thank everyone for joining me today, and thank you to Global Water Futures for having us. I think the next week is going to be very interesting for all of us, I'm sure, and all those watching the Canada Water Agency. But I still have some hope that it will be a strong start, and that, especially with leadership that we see on this panel, that we have a good direction that we're heading in. So thank you again, and thanks for joining all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.